Good morning and welcome to the Civic Caucus Friday interview. It's Friday, February 12th, 2021, and I'm Janice Clegg, chair of the Civic Caucus, dedicated to nonpartisan debate and discussion of issues important to Minnesota. Today, we will continue our series of sessions looking at Minneapolis charter reform. Lee Munnich will start us off with an introduction of our speaker, Barry Clegg, chair of the Minneapolis Charter Commission. Clarence Schallbetter will moderate. I'm glad to be joined today by the Civic Caucus interview group and want to express our very, very sincere, deep gratitude to Barry Clegg for joining us today to help us learn about this very important and timely topic and the dedicated work of the Charter Commission. With that, I will turn things over to Lee.
Thank you, Janice. Barry Clegg is somebody that I've just gotten to know recently. But he's one of these great citizen leaders that we all appreciate that's maybe flown below the radar for many years. He's an attorney with Lathrop GPM, and he's been
Morning, Paul.
member of the Charter Commission since 2003. He's been chair of the Charter Commission since 2013. He also has served on the board of Neighborhood Housing Service from 1985 to 2015. He's been on the Minneapolis Commission on Civil Rights from 1986 to 1998. He's also been chair of my neighborhood, the Nicollet Island East Bank Neighborhood Association, in the past. He also, in his bio, I saw that he has honors, in his honors listed him as one of the best lawyers in America from 2010 to 2021. So in spite of all of these things that he does, he must find some time to practice law. So I'm pleased to introduce our guest, Barry Clegg.
Great, thanks much. Barry, again, we do welcome you. We're very delighted that we have heard a lot now about your historical involvement and interest in charter changes. It's been remarkable, and as Lee indicated, it's largely been below the surface. People don't realize what's been going on, but we would love to hear you tell us what's been going on and where are we at. Barry.
Thank you. What a lot of people don't know about charter commissions is that they are provided for in the Minnesota Constitution. They are required if you are a charter city as opposed to a statutory city. Every charter city, by definition, has a charter commission because the charter commission is the way you adopt a charter and it's the way you amend a charter. There are 4 different ways to amend charters in Minnesota, and all of them flow through or near the Charter Commission. The Charter Commission itself can propose an amendment to go on the ballot. And if it does so, it goes on the ballot. There's no review by the city council. The can't veto it. It's on the ballot, period. The council can put a proposed charter amendment on the ballot, but they have to send it to the Charter Commission first. And the Charter Commission has up to 150 days to review the council proposal. The council, even if the Charter Commission disagrees, the council can put it on the ballot, but not until that 150 days has run. And if this sounds familiar, that's what happened to the Minneapolis Council's public safety proposal last year. They gave it to the Charter Commission too late for that 150 days to run. They asked the Charter Commission to instead consider it in 40 days, and the Charter Commission said no. So it did not go on the ballot. Another way to get an amendment on the ballot is by citizen petition. The petition has to be signed by a number equal to 5% of those who voted in the last general election. Since we just had the biggest turnout in a general election in history, that number is now 11,992 signatures required. And they have to be registered voters, not just signatures, not just residents, but registered voters. And the city clerk's office goes through that list in detail and looks up every one to make sure they're registered. And the rule of thumb is you've got to get, if you want 12,000 good signatures, you've got to try for about 18 or 20,000, because a lot of them either won't be registered, or they were registered, but they lived in Iowa, or they said they were registered, but they really aren't, because who wants to admit that they're not registered voter? And the final way to amend the charter also flows through the Charter Commission. If an amendment is approved by the mayor, the Charter Commission, and all 13 council members, then it's called an amendment by ordinance, and that does not require a citizen vote. So those tend to be things that are to conform with changes in state law, things that are non-controversial. But even there, even in the case of an amendment by ordinance, the voters do have the right, if they petition 5% of the voters, to recall that and bring it back to a vote of the citizens. So the voters always have some recourse, and neither the council nor the Charter Commission can change the charter by themselves. All they can do is put these changes forward to the voters. The voters ultimately decide the fate of the charter. The Charter Commission looks at 6 different criteria when it considers an ordinance. Is the amendment germane to the charter? For example, the $15 minimum wage was proposed initially as a charter amendment. And we concluded that it was not germane to the charter, because the charter covers the form and structure of municipal government and does not regulate private conduct. The city can regulate private conduct, but that's more akin to an ordinance and not a charter provision. The Supreme Court agreed and did not put that on the ballot. The council subsequently adopted an ordinance providing for a $15 minimum wage, but it's not in the charter. Second, is the amendment well considered? I may have a great idea to amend the charter. It may be the most brilliant idea ever seen, but unless the public has been talking about it, unless it's had a chance to get public input and public consideration, we don't want to put it on the ballot. We call that, is it well baked, as opposed to half baked. Third criteria is the amendment clear and specific? Fourth, does the proposed amendment interfere with or take away any rights of the voters? We would tend not to put something on the ballot that takes away a right from the voters. Fifth, is the proposed amendment consistent with state law? And sixth, is the proposed amendment necessary to accommodate its intended objective? There are a number of possible amendments this year. The council is considering 2 possible amendments, one providing for rent control. And even though that regulates private conduct, it's appropriate for a charter amendment because the state statute says it is. There's a state statute that says cities of the first class can have rent control, but only if it's provided for in their charter. The council is also proposing another public safety amendment, which looks sort of like the one they proposed last year, but with some changes. And that's not finally drafted yet, so we don't know exactly what that looks like. There's also rumors of a petition being circulated, which is a conflicting public safety amendment, which I think would eliminate the police department in its entirety without proposing a replacement. And that petition drive, I believe, kicks off tomorrow. The Charter Commission itself is proposing what we call a government structure amendment, which would create an executive mayor / legislative council system, as opposed to the system we have now. The system we have now is not really a weak mayor system. In a true weak mayor system, the mayor wouldn't have a veto, for example. The mayor wouldn't be primarily responsible for the budget. We have sort of a hybrid system, and it's really unique in the entire United States. A traditional mayor-council system has the mayor as the executive branch of government, and the council as the legislative branch of government, akin to what we have in the United States generally. The Minneapolis Charter, as you probably know, was created in 1920 after the voters had rejected several proposed charters. And essentially, they just put together all the special laws in the state that applied to Minneapolis and said, okay, here's your charter. And that finally passed. But within even a few years of that passing in 1920, the charter was criticized heavily because it lacks a central executive authority. Governing authority resides in the council. The council has always had a role in administration by virtue of its ability to either appoint department heads in the city of Minneapolis or to reappoint them or not, in essence, have control of whether or not they continue to have a job. This was changed in the late 1980s because of Mayor Fraser's efforts to provide for more input by the mayor, resulting in the executive committee, which consists of the mayor and several council members, including the council president. But still, there's primarily the council is responsible for appointing and confirming and retaining department heads in the city. What the Charter Commission is looking at this year, again, we call an executive mayor legislative council system. It's a fairly simple change to make the Minneapolis Charter more closely align with what most mayor council systems are. The mayor would be responsible for appointing department heads, subject to confirmation by the council, as is consistent with its legislative function. And department heads would basically serve at the pleasure of the mayor. So the mayor could also terminate a department head. And department heads would have terms of every 4 years, concurrent with the term of the mayor. So every new mayor would get their own opportunity to appoint department heads. But despite having terms of 4 years, again, they're serving at the pleasure of the mayor. So the mayor could terminate a department head in mid-term. The current status of this amendment is that a subcommittee of the Charter Commission is working on drafting. There are drafts currently circulating that are attached to the Charter Commission's webpage in the Minneapolis Legislative Information Management System, known as LIMS. We're continuing to massage that draft back and forth, and we expect to have something to propose to the full Charter Commission in March. The Charter Commission would likely hold at least one public hearing. Since it's virtual, we'll probably hold multiple public hearings, so we'll keep going until we've run through the list of everybody who wants to comment. And then April or May at the latest, we would move it forward to the ballot. The Charter Commission decides what the amendment's going to look like. The City Council actually is responsible for developing the ballot question language. But in reality, that means it's done by the City Attorney's Office. So we're going to submit a proposed ballot question language along with the proposed amendment. And we are working with the City Attorney's Office to get that done. The City Attorney's Office represents the city, obviously, but also represents the Charter Commission, which puts it in a weird position sometimes if there are conflicts between the two. Now I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Gilgee here. Do I understand that the charter amendment will not say anything about the police?
The charter amendment being proposed by the Charter Commission will not directly mention the police department, but it will affect public safety in our city, because right now the mayor is theoretically responsible for the operation of the police department. But again, because of the council's ability to confirm that police officer, our council is a very, I will say, active council. During the civic unrest in 2020, we had at least one council member on the street attempting to give orders to police officers that were contrary to the orders they were receiving through the chain of command. We have multiple other departments other than the police department, which are not subject to control of the mayor. And I'm talking about the Office of Emergency Management, which is a department, 911, which is a department, the Office of Violence Prevention, and the fire department. Those all really relate to public safety, and none of them are under the control of the mayor. So although the police department is not specifically mentioned in this proposed amendment, it would benefit greatly, in our view, from this kind of direct accountability and structure.
I had a question, Barry. What are the problems or the things that are happening in the city today that would lead you to want to propose this kind of a change?
Shorthand for it is the 14 boss problem. Department heads don't report to a central executive authority. Rather, they really report to the mayor and 13 council members. And people have written about this before, and that's probably the best way to shorthand it. But basically, the mayor has the title, the executive title, but no responsibility. And the council has the authority, but no accountability. We have, one of the things we did in this process is talk to as many department heads as we could. We talked to 18 out of 22 department heads. We talked to them on an anonymous basis so they would feel free to comment without concern for their jobs. There was unanimous authority that our current system doesn't work. One comment was that our system is inefficient in the best of times, and in crisis, it just doesn't work at all. We have situations where individual council members show up in a department head's office and give them lists of things they want them to do. These are not things that are consistent with ordinance. They're not consistent with policy. They are just individual council member demands. And it's made pretty clear that if they're not done, their job is in peril. So those are the kinds of problems we're trying to address by putting a central executive authority over the administrative staff of the city, right, and reserving the legislative role to the council.
We typically talk about the separation between executive and legislative. And executive understood to be the agency that administers and carries out the law and provides the services. It gets a little fuzzier when you get into the policy arena because there may in fact really be a division of differences about policy direction. If a majority of the city council should say we want to eliminate all parking in all streets in Minneapolis, and the mayor says, no, I do not want to see that happening. Council adopts this thing, mayor vetoes it. We have this tussle over the policy question, which is pretty fundamental. It kind of tests, in fact, this separation idea because it is not just an executive function, it becomes the policy function as well. What do you think about that?
It does, but the mayor has a very significant role in policy, which you just noted. The mayor has a veto right. So instead of requiring 7 votes, a vetoed ordinance or vetoed policy requires 9.
So the mayor really is heavy on the policy side then as well.
Pardon me?
As a consequence, the mayor really is the heavy on the policy side as well.
That's right. That's right.
That's got to be clear because it seems to me that's part of the challenge we've got in the arena there today, where in effect, a significant number of the council members may be going in a different direction than what the mayor is going to want to go. And maybe
ultimately, if there are votes,
they're not 9 of them, maybe there's only 8 of them, but it's still going to be a real tussle over the question of, well, who's really in charge of the policy? And the mayor can be appointing department heads in the public, in the public roads department, or whatever you call it, the public works department, who is very sympathetic to eliminating all parking because it's just one of the new inspirations we had in public works administration. And that real tussle, is it going to be it's going to be a tough one. Could be.
Right, right.
And giving the mayor authority over the Public Works Department, basically the hiring and firing of that executive director,
Right.
that department head would know that they work for the mayor.
Right.
What
I assume they'll be
expect-
sympathetic to the mayor's policy direction.
what I would expect would happen is at the beginning of every term, a capable mayor would call the department heads to a meeting and say, you guys all work for me. If if a city council member shows up in your office and says, I want you to do this, you tell them to come and talk to me.
Oh, God.
Yeah, it
Can
does.
Can I ask a question? Does the legislature have any role at all because in what the Charter Commission does or what they can do to help Minneapolis?
Well, the legislature does have a role because I said there were 4 ways to amend the charter. There's actually a sneak around 5th way, which is a special law. The legislator can pass a law applicable only to the city of Minneapolis. But if they do so, either a majority of the council have to agree to support the statute, or it goes to a vote of the citizens. But there are ways to work around that as well. The state has numerous laws that apply to all cities of the first class. Well, there's 4 cities of the first class in Minnesota: Minneapolis, St. Paul, Duluth, and Rochester. So it would be easy for the state legislature to develop a statute that applied to all cities of the first class, but was really sort of pointing at Minneapolis, and there are lots of those already. So.
Okay, see, I wanted to actually just thank you, Barry, for that incredible introduction. I always think about what our 8,500 readers are going to learn from these sessions, and I certainly hope they listen and pay attention, because that was a lot of great information. I wanted to ask you about the budget and staffing, or lack thereof, of the Charter Commission, and how that's going to impact this possibly really high-profile election coming up. And also note that you seem to have gotten some good publicity in the Star Tribune this morning, and maybe we can screen share that if possible. So let's talk a little bit about your staffing and budget and communications department.
The Charter Commission is 15 citizens of Minneapolis. We're all appointed by the chief judge of Hennepin County, and every charter city is appointed by the chief judge of the county in which the city resides. And we work for free. We don't get paid. We don't have a budget. We don't have a treasurer because we don't have any money. We are supported by the city clerk's office and by the city attorney's office. Every meeting we have is usually attended by a member of the city attorney's office and a member of the clerk's office, and usually these days the clerk, Casey Carl, as well. But in terms of a budget to advance a proposal after it's put on the ballot, the Charter Commission has no resources at all.
So do you then just depend upon organizations and media and newspapers and that kind of thing?
That's why charter change is so very hard, because to develop the plain language charter, for example, which was adopted in 2013, the Charter Commission worked for 11 years. And we had our first draft done in the first year, but we wanted to make it so that no one was opposed to it, because any organized opposition almost dooms a charter proposal, because there's usually no big vote yes effort. Usually the efforts are vote no. And if there's any and a lot of current elected officials opposed to a charter amendment, it will likely fail. So this amendment specifically will have a tough row to hoe. It's going to be opposed by at least some council members, possibly a majority of council members. It will be supported by the mayor, and it will be supported by at least a couple of council members, I think.
Barry Gilgee here. Question, when does your amendment go into effect? Right away or after the next election?
That's an interesting question. We just had a conversation with the city's department heads about that subject. What we normally do when we propose an amendment is we go to city staff and say, how long will it take you to implement this? You know, if there's any changes you have to make in your department, how long will it take you to do this? For the plain language charter, we made it effective 1 year after it passed. And we asked the department heads this time the same question: how long would it take you to implement this? And they summoned us to a call with what I'll call the core group of city departments, including police, public works, et cetera, some of the biggest departments in the city, and told us in no uncertain terms, this can't wait. This has to be done now. So I think we're likely to take that advice, and in which case the amendment would take effect 30 days after it was approved by the voters.
Barry, I have a question referring to the issue of publicizing these proposals. You said that the opposition is always organized. What methods in the past have been used to get a positive agenda and support for a change? How does that work, or how do you guys think about getting support for needed change in the charter? What methods are available and that have worked in the past and might work in the future?
Civic organizations are great. I mean, I will cite the League of Women Voters. They helped us tremendously in getting the plain language charter passed. The mayoral candidates, and that was in 2013 when there were like 30 of them, but about 8 of them were invited to a debate that was moderated by the League of Women Voters. And not all of those candidates were necessarily in favor of the plain language charter. But the first question the League of Women Voters asked them is, the city is considering a plain language charter that is supported by the League of Women Voters. Are you in favor of it? In one word, yes or no? And you could see all the candidates gulp, and they went down the line and they all said yes, they were in favor of it. And after that, it didn't have any organized opposition. So that kind of support could be tremendously valuable.
But you know, a debate like that could go forward, but who knows about the debate and pays attention to it? How is that activity made public so that, you know, the voters can know about it? We used to have, you know, a newspaper available that covered this kind of stuff at the local level. And when every household got a newspaper, it was easier to follow this stuff. But that's a fairly limited outlet these days compared with what's needed, especially at the municipal level.
I think there will be a lot of publicity about this particular proposal because it's so significantly affects the structure of our city. Mm-hmm. And I think there will be some organized vote yes organizations that will, so including former elected officials.
So Barry, if I could ask you, one of the pieces of this that I think needs conversation is that there are situations in St. Paul, I know this has happened, certainly nationally, we can look at it with the abuse of executive orders, some might say, kind of the flip side of things, where the city council passes an action and the mayor just decides not to do it. And I don't need to go into history, but I had a couple experiences like this. You know, one of them had to do with a crime lab, having Hennepin County and the city work together. And I don't want to get into great detail. It just never happened because it wasn't supported at the mayoral level. So the city administrator part of it is at least the thinking goes, kind of an honest broker, in that if there's an action that is approved, those actions have. So how do you respond to some who might say they agree with that split, but are concerned about the executive essentially ignoring the policies passed by the council?
The council does have the option to remove the mayor. The council can remove the mayor for cause. And cause, in my mind, would include ignoring a legitimate ordinance approved by the council. In terms of this, whether or not the city manager route is appropriate for Minneapolis, at least we felt that going to an appointed official as the executive of the city was a bridge too far for the citizens of Minneapolis. It was our thought on the Charter Commission that the voters will want their chief executive to be elected and to have say into who that is. So that was the basis for our judgment.
So you're working with the chief of staff, not an independent city manager.
That's correct.
So the coordinator becomes the chief of staff rather than the coordinator.
No, the coordinator is essentially responsible for running all of the non-charter city departments. There are 22 departments in the city. About half of them are mentioned in the charter, including the police department, obviously. The other half are not. So things like 911 is a department, but it's not mentioned in the charter at all. Being a non-charter department just means it exists because the city council wants it to. The city council can create non-charter departments and can abolish them, but charter departments are protected by the charter and can only be eliminated by the voters.
How about the fire department?
The fire department is a charter department
Oh,
and can only be eliminated by the voters.
I have a question, if I might, going back to the lack of a budget and the lack of funds then to promote a charter. I was sitting here thinking about the school district model. School districts, if they want to promote a referendum, cannot use public funds or school district funds to promote a referendum. So they typically appoint a referendum committee that is arm's length and then raises the funds and so on separate from the school district to promote a referendum. What would prevent the Charter Commission from having a committee like a typical school district would have and then promote the charter amendment?
I don't know that anything would prohibit that. And in fact, on past significant changes, charter commissioners have been very active in working with citizen groups, et cetera, to get the word out and to speak in favor of charter proposals.
I guess I was thinking more of with the committee that the school districts have, they also work with various groups that would have an interest in the referendum. But they do have that umbrella group, if you will, that would coordinate a lot of that activity, and that's the referendum committee made up of citizens.
I don't think anything would prevent that from happening on a more formal basis, but informally, it happens now.
So if I could follow up on, excuse me, Lyndon's question, Barry, I was quite alarmed personally because if I read it correctly, there's $500,000 that might go into supporting the city council's public safety charter change from, I think, a Washington, D.C. based nonprofit. And apart from the merits, that's concerning to have that amount of money on whatever side a charter issue might come from, to come from outside state, outside the city. So I would encourage you and your colleagues as you're looking at this to Representative Carlson's question, how more of a locally financed effort could happen to at least, because I'm just concerned that that's going to overwhelm the kind of fundraising that your effort might need.
No, you're right. That's why charter change is so difficult.
Right.
Is there a reason the Charter Commission was created as an entity that has that doesn't have funding and has volunteer members to begin with?
The charter commissions are called out by the state constitution and they're implemented by state statute. And the statute says, it doesn't say anything about paying charter commissions. It requires the city, the charter city, to support its charter commission and provide, I think, up to $10,000 a year for expenses. Now I believe it's been increased to $25,000 a year for cities of the first class for expenses to retain attorneys to assist in drafting amendments. But we have the city attorney's office that works for us for free, so we've never used that.
Yeah, I'm sure when that was put in, you couldn't imagine an expensive media campaign and out-of-state money and all these kind of things that could well happen this year. So Helen, would you have a chance to share the op-ed?
Right, yeah, I want to just share quickly, draw everyone's attention to the editorial in the Star Tribune this morning, seeking a stronger, more efficient Minneapolis City Hall, giving some recognition to your work with the Charter Commission. So I'd urge everyone, our viewers, to take a look at that as well.
That's great. That's great.
Yeah.
So Barry, how would you compare your changes to what St. Paul has?
It's pretty close. St. Paul has a provision that says department heads are appointed by the mayor. In one sentence, they say department heads are appointed by the mayor, confirmed by the council, and serve at the pleasure of the mayor, period. They do have terms for, I believe, the police chief and the fire chief. Other department heads are confirmed by the council, but then never have to go back before the council again. So ours is a little different in that we would have department heads go back before the council every 4 years, but that would be after the election of a mayor. Presumably most councils would be willing to work with a new mayor to put that mayor's team in place.
Barry,
Go ahead.
can I ask one question about what kind of support you're getting, or if any, from the labor movement in the Minneapolis?
Good question.
The labor movement hasn't really been involved.
Should they be? Should they be? I mean,
Would that help?
I think it wouldn't make sense for them to be. I think Minneapolis would run more efficiently and with less turnover at the highest levels.
Who currently is involved in negotiating the employee contracts in Minneapolis? And who would be under this proposal?
Usually that's the executive committee. or
That's doing it now?
Yes, or the committee, the council committee that is responsible for that area.
But doesn't the mayor have to sign the thing too?
Yes, the mayor has to sign.
So
The mayor ultimately signs.
he has some voice in the thing and some portion of this.
The executive committee under our proposal would go away.
Okay, but then who's going to be responsible for negotiating the contents of all those city contracts?
In all likelihood, it would be the mayor's office, and with input from the council committee having jurisdiction over that area. For example, if it's the police contract, it would be the public safety committee of the council.
If Barry doesn't mind my interjecting, having served on the executive committee, we would never negotiate directly with a bargaining unit. We would get updates from those who negotiate on our behalf. but we would never actually do the negotiating.
Yeah,
I think, I'm sure you meant that, Barry, but yeah.
Well, but
It was
who's that-
staff goes in the room with the union people and says, you know, we can give you 10 cents an hour, but not 20 cents an hour.
But who sets the parameters on the management side? And how is that explicitly known to the voters of the city? Well, I mean, that's a question.
It is a question. I think the executive committee would largely set those parameters. The executive committee would charge the actual negotiator with what their objectives are and what they were allowed to agree to and what they couldn't agree to. Again, with input from a particular committee having jurisdiction over the union matter.
How are those made public?
I believe meetings of the executive committee are public meetings. Are they, Paul?
They are, but without exception, they're always closed anytime neighbor negotiations are discussed. So that's a whole other issue that you don't want me to get on a tangent about. But I think that's a very important point, is why are those always private? Because the honest answer to Clarence's question is you're never going to know which council member took what position on any provision in a labor negotiation.
Well, could I want to get back to the 14 boss issue. It seems to me that may be the fundamental issue that you dealt with, both with the charter, the proposal that the city council put forward on the police department last year, as well as the proposal you're putting together. It seems to me that if you're going to explain this to the public, that 14 boss issue is something that they could understand. And I think if we're going to deal with the police department problems and get those resolved, 14 bosses is not the way to do it. If we're going to deal with overall issues in the city, the 14 boss problem. So could you say more about that? I know you spent a lot of time talking about this on the commission. Could you expand a little bit more on that problem?
I think you're absolutely right that that's the way to sell this to the public, because that's been discussed in the public arena. There have been editorial and commentaries submitted to the paper that have talked about the 14 boss problem. That's an easy way to summarize it that most people will understand. And again, talking about some of the examples, we have council members going into department heads and saying, we want you to do this. And again, it's not staff direction, it's not policy, it's not pursuant to ordinance, it's just an individual council member going in and saying, I want a stop sign at this corner or something like that. And what we're trying to do is empower the department heads to say, thank you very much, council member, for bringing that to my attention. Now get out of my office.
And with regard to the police department, which is probably the major concern that people have, both from the viewpoint of how we deal with the problem of the George Floyd killing and racial inequities. How do you think about how the 14 boss approach would aggravate that problem rather than solving the problem?
How would it aggravate?
I mean, you clearly came out against the earlier version of the city council amendment that would have created 14 bosses for a new department. But could you say, did you explore the problems that might occur with the police department if you move to that type of system?
Well, it would make put the police department on par with all the other departments where there is a well-established 14 boss problem. Right now, the police department, as you know, the charter provides that the mayor has, quote, complete power over the police department. The only place in a charter where those two words are used. Nobody has complete power under the Minneapolis Charter except the mayor with respect to the police department. And when we talked to all the department heads, the police chief was consistently saying, you know, I've got it better than the rest of these people because I just theoretically have one boss. But that's very theoretical because the council acts through its public safety committee. The council acts as stated by attempting to get in and give commands to police officers. And it's even the police department is a mess, but making the police department like all the other departments in the city would be even worse.
It seems
Barry,
to
could
me
you
what
speak-
you're getting,
I'm sorry, Barry, could you speak to the leadership of Casey Carl? It's very interesting to me because I can tell you that when I was making my attempts 12 years ago, almost every department head came to me, made sure the door was closed or they were whispering and nobody could see them, and say, great idea, Paul. But none of them would say that publicly. And here you've got someone who is subject to removal by the council, who, and again, I don't know how much you can speak to this, but how important has his leadership been in this effort?
Who is Casey Carl?
Casey Carl, the
Carl.
city clerk.
And the city clerk has been very supportive, but that's their job. I mean, their job is to support the council, and their job is also to support the Charter Commission. So both on the public safety amendment last year and on this proposal, the resources of the clerk's office have been made available to us. I don't think because they're publicly supporting this amendment or any other amendment, but just because that's their job to support us. And they've done a very good job in helping us move
Well,
forward.
the clerk's office has just taken maybe more than in my experience, very much a leadership staff role, regardless of whether the initiative is coming from you or from the council on these proposed amendments.
That's right. And I suspect they will also take a role in the council's amendments because they work for.
Can I ask two questions?
Sure.
Does your proposal envision or require a city administrator to be under the mayor? And the second question is, who under your proposal would actually be dealing with the contracts that the city signs, especially employee contracts? Would it be the mayor's office or the city administrator if you plan that? The city attorney, what? Who?
We are not contemplating a city administrator. The city coordinator, which exists now and again is in charge of all non-charter departments, would continue to exist. And because the executive committee would go away, labor negotiations would be up to the mayor, usually with input from the council having jurisdiction over that collective bargaining agreement, and would be ultimately approved by the council. So the council still has the right to approve, but who the actual negotiator would be a city staff person under the leadership of the mayor and with input from the committee having jurisdiction.
does the coordinator serve at the pleasure of the mayor?
Who is
The coordinator, right now, the coordinator is appointed through the executive committee process, but under our proposal, the coordinator would be nominated by the mayor, confirmed by the council, and would serve at the pleasure of the mayor.
Oh,
Excellent.
huh, okay.
May I ask or suggest, it seems to me that the charter amendment that you're proposing is so sensible that anybody who understands it would say, yes, let's do it. But it seems to me the leverage that Lee was talking about, if we can tie charter improvement with the failure of the police department that everybody saw, that if you want your police department to work better, you got to have this charter change. They're a package. that would be a marketing strategy that might work. Because everybody saw how disastrous the police performance was, not because of the individual officers, but because of the lack of chain of command.
Well, there was a change of command, though. That's the problem. There was a change.
Not when there's a council member out there trying to tell the police.
No, there was a mayor who has the power, the complete power. That's the problem. In this instance, it's a really tough one. In this instance, it's really tough because clearly the charter gives the mayor full power over that department.
Although the city attorney has opined that the city council has the same authority over the police department as they have over all other departments. It's in writing. It was done as part of their analysis of the public safety amendment proposed last year.
So the city attorney has opined in behalf of the city council's role in the police department.
Correct.
We have a little conflict in-house that's pretty significant, but it's a conflict in-house.
That sounds very significant.
Very significant, but you know.
Well, the city attorney prepared that opinion at the request of the Charter Commission. So.
Huh.
How would
The city council was saying, we don't have any authority over the police department and things will be better if you give the city council authority. And the city attorney basically said, you already have authority over the police department. You have the same authority you should have over every other department. You have the power of the purse. So you have
basically the problem though is that what you're saying, if you move to the city council's approach, you say you're going to have 14 bosses telling the police chief what to do, or the head of the new department that's being created. I mean, one of the things that I've heard about some of the private polling that's been going on is that the city council is not very popular at all right now. The mayor is not, is slightly more popular than the city council members, but not very popular. But the police chief is popular, or at least the public supports him more. So, I mean, part of the question is, you know, would that police chief be able to do a better job of running the police department if he had 14 bosses rather than one boss? That's not saying the council's still involved in setting the policies and maybe, you know, certainly funding the department and that sort of thing. But if they're actually running it and trying to tell the police chief what to do, you know, it's going to be a mess. And somehow or another, that message needs to be communicated to the public. That's where the you know, the problems that we have now would be made much worse. There's a whole bunch of other issues that have to be addressed, you know, like state laws related to arbitration, things like that, and, you know, changing the culture of the police department over time that are maybe a little bit more complicated to explain. But it seems to me that somehow or another, we've got to get this basic message across that you can't run a department with 14 bosses.
And my view is that changing the name of the police department to the Division of Law Enforcement Services and moving it under the control of the council is not reform. Reform implies improvement. That is not reform. It is just a change of control. And as you said, Lee, it makes the police department subject to 14 bosses. So whether or not the Charter Commission's proposal would make that better, the council's proposal would certainly make it much worse.
Let's
So
go
Barry,
back. Go back to Lee's point about state rules regarding arbitration issues, which seem to handicap the police chief in doing the police chief's job. This is something that's been mentioned in the press several times, and it's important. If the mayor has control over the police, but the state law handicaps both the police chief and the mayor in terms of managing the department, then some attention should be focused on what's going on at the state level that makes it so hard for these issues to be resolved at the city level.
It makes it very hard at the state level because most Republicans are opposed to anything that would that would that the law enforcement community is not in favor of, and most Democrats support labor-related causes, and the police department is subject to PELRA, as are all police departments in the state. So that's the Public Employees Labor Relations Act. So to carve up PELRA and make it more restrictive would probably be opposed by both people who supported law enforcement causes and liberals who support the rights of employees.
So you
So
can change,
I have to
you can
jump in,
change the
John.
charter and you're still not going to solve the problem then.
John, I have to jump in because right now in the Chauvin case,
Yeah.
there are numerous, at least 3, if not 4, prior circumstances where Derek Chauvin used chokeholds, and he was never disciplined.
Yep.
He was quote unquote coached,
Yep.
which they've said is not discipline. So if you go to an arbitration on Derek Chauvin, you probably lose. So I think there's a myth that somehow that's the problem. The problem is that the city's disciplinary process has been horribly broken for years. And so I think the challenge is, how do you connect this charter issue to that? Because it's been ongoing, you know, honestly speaking, it was there when I was there. It gotten worse, but we
But these
completely
are all
fail in discipline officers. So how do you tie that to the charter? Because if we,
Clearly, at this point, the mayor has responsibility, power for that department.
well, but
Can't the mayor basically take some actions relative to that department? And secondly, can't the mayor lead by saying we want these kinds of changes made in state law? Now, what prevents the mayor from leading on substantive questions about the police law enforcement issues?
But Clarence, he could change city policy.
Right?
He could say you don't get coaching 4 times for choking somebody.
That's what I'm saying. What
Yeah.
prevents the mayor from doing this stuff?
It depends on what the bargaining agreement says.
That's what I'm saying. Who's engaged in the bargaining unit discussions on the management side, and how public are they?
There are a lot of officer protections built into the collective bargaining agreement that Minneapolis has with the Police Officers Federation that have been negotiated by councils and mayors over many, many years. And some of them were probably a bad idea, and maybe that was the city's, we'll give you this and we'll save a nickel an hour. And we'll give you this thing on coaching and arbitration and everything else. But a lot of it is built into the bargaining agreement. A lot of it is built into state law. And those are things that the council can't change. So I think they're going after this charter proposal because that's perhaps less significant and less likely to have an effect, but it's what they can do.
But the mayor is now one of the chief spokespeople for the city, who can say to the legislature, we need the following kinds of changes for whatever purpose. And certainly the city council has been able to play that game as well. But what prevents the mayor from saying, here's what this city needs to remedy the problems it's got?
To a certain extent, I think that's happened. For example, and the legislature passed a bill after the murder of George Floyd, which incorporated some changes. But for example, Minneapolis at times has had a residency requirement for the police department, and that was eliminated by the state legislature. And it's now against the law to have a residency requirement for your police department. I think the mayor would suggest that that's probably a good idea. What the proposal did after George Floyd's murder was permit municipalities to look at that as one factor, but you still can't rule out somebody just because they live in another jurisdiction. So I think the mayor
give them
has
incentives for living in the city. I think.
Correct. That's right. Like they can help with a down on your house or something like that.
Barry, can you explain, and we're talking all around it here, exactly what changes would take place in the administration or whatever of the police department under your amendment, how would things change? Because that's what a lot of people are looking for.
What would change would be the mayor would be in charge of all public safety staff in the city, including the police department, the fire department, Office of Emergency Management, and Office of Violence Prevention. They would have a direct reporting line to the mayor as opposed to the council.
Would the police chief and fire chief have to be approved by the council or not?
Yes, all department heads, including police and fire, would have to be confirmed by the council after being nominated by the mayor. And they would serve a 4-year term, but would serve at the pleasure of the mayor. So the mayor could discharge them before the end of their term.
And how is that different from how it is now in terms of discharging the police chief?
The police chief to be discharged now would have to be, correct me if I'm wrong, Paul, but it would have to be terminated by the executive committee.
Barry, you're correct. And some might remember when Mayor Ryback started that he attempted to essentially fire Chief Robert Olson. So as a brand new minted council president, I was in the very awkward position of wanting to support my mayor, but also trying to communicate that that was not something he could do. I don't know how many folks remember that, but that's right. A termination would have to be approved by the executive committee and the full council. And there's historically been severance pay, which has been a very significant issue. So if you terminated somebody within their term, and I know many who represented, many in the system said that you needed that severance pay provision to get people to work in Minneapolis, because if they were subject to the whims and caprices and could be terminated at will, certainly by the council, that they wouldn't take the job.
On the same matter, who in the new proposal is going to negotiate the terms and the conditions and the amount of payment for civil settlements with the city for behavior of the police?
City attorney.
Those settlements are always approved by the council, ultimately.
What's the role of the mayor going to be on this one?
I don't think the mayor would have a role.
Oh.
The council,
A settlement?
Yeah, settlement for
Those-
civil.
matters are litigated by the city attorney's office, and the council ultimately approves settlements. And there's nothing in our proposal that would change that.
So they have to handle the consequences politically of that, not the mayor.
Well, I think everyone would have to handle the consequences of that. The council would approve the settlements, but the mayor would be in charge of the police department. So
The mayor could veto a settlement. I don't think I see that. I see that happen once or twice.
any action of the city council. And the mayor signs off on actions of the city council. So the mayor either approves or vetoes.
Do you have a feeling that there's more support for what you're doing, that it's growing for your proposal?
I think there is this year, which is a reason to do it this year. As I think I said earlier, during good times and in the absence of a crisis, and if the personalities mesh, the city works. It's inefficient, but it works. I mean, looking back at some past mayors and council presidents that have gotten along and figured out what they're each going to do, the city has by and large worked. But when it comes to a crisis or if there's a conflict in personalities, it doesn't work. And I think people are seeing that this year more than ever. So are paying more attention and are probably more likely to support structural change.
The Tribune Editorial is an example of growing support, I think, Pat, don't you?
Yeah, yeah.
people are paying attention.
Has the commission, the Charter Commission, been able to do anything to estimate the cost savings from this proposal in light of how things are done today?
No. And I don't know how it could be measured, but the current system is very inefficient, with department heads responding to the mayor and 13 council members. Would there be time saved, effort saved? Certainly. Would there be cost savings? Yes, but I don't know how to quantify that.
If I could interject, we looked at that too. I can't remember if we presented much of that to the commission, because it's really productivity. You know, when I look back, and I know you know this from your research, at all the meetings with 7, 8, 9, 10 staff people that I confess I was in on, you know, that happened all the time. When I know those same meetings were happening with other council members, that's what's hard to get your handle on, is that the magnitude of the staff time that is spent on day-to-day administrative matters with individual council members.
It sounds like some marketing volunteer time and maybe a campaign would be helpful here to the commission.
Yep.
Voter education. It's just such an important, but such a complicated communication effort that you got to do.
And this is also a municipal year, so there's only a municipal election in 2021. There is not a state or federal election.
That's
So
probably great.
it will likely have a lower turnout
Right.
than there was last year, for example,
What does it take?
especially
Especially
if
to pass it?
big contest for mayor.
Yeah.
A big contest for mayor usually drives up the municipal turnout.
What does it take to pass? Just a simple.
51%. Oddly, it's not a majority, it's 51%. That's what the state law says. And it probably reads that way because whatever legislator drafted it thought that's what a majority meant. But it requires 51% affirmative votes. And if it involves alcohol, it requires 55%.
Wow. Still in there.
That's still in there. That's
Yeah.
why when we proposed the plain language charter, we actually separated it into 2 questions. One dealing with alcohol and one dealing with everything else. Because what would have happened if it passed with 53% of the vote?
Is it of those voting or?
Yes, it's those voting. It's not like at the state constitution where a failure to vote is the same as a no vote.
So those
Mary, I
voting
guess-
on any race in that election, of voters showing up and casting a ballot
On the charter amendment.
On that question.
on that
Yeah.
question.
On that question, huh?
Would
Jerry,
you-
given my own failure or at least lack of success, maybe I shouldn't say failure of getting anything passed, I shouldn't be giving any PR advice, but it does seem to me that it's not so much that the system doesn't work, or the system works as long as there's not a crisis. I think to some extent the message should be a lot of these things that are now becoming crises would not have become crisis if we had the right kind of form of government in the first place. What has not been done over these years that we really have needed to be done that has been blocked by not having the right form of government. Because I don't want people going into thinking this works okay, and we're, as long as we don't have a crisis, I'm fearful that I think we're in a crisis, at least in part, because of this, might be the stronger message.
I think that's right. And in fact, when we talk to both council members, former electeds, and when we talk to department heads, one of our questions was, well, how are conflicts resolved? And the straightforward answer was, well, sometimes they're just not. The ball either gets dropped, the policy ball gets dropped and never picked up again, or the issue is not resolved.
But let me ask, I don't want to stop talking about these other two important amendments, but could you say something about the rent control proposal and where that's coming from and what it would do?
Many years ago, I think back in the 80s, the city considered rent control, and the state legislature didn't want them to without a vote of the voters, so that a law was passed in the legislature that provided that cities of the first class can have rent control, but only if it's authorized in their charter. So the change to the charter would just say, under Minnesota statute XYZ, the city council may pass an ordinance dealing with the control of rents. And that's all the charter would say. And then it would leave it up to the council to actually draft the rent control ordinance. So if you vote for that, you would likely be taking a leap of faith and saying, okay, we'll let the council decide what it wants to do. The council, with that in the charter, the council could do nothing, or it could adopt a specific rent control provision.
However, if the public voted in favor of that, that would probably be sending a signal or an argument that council members should pass rent control.
Yes.
Certainly get the renters out.
Probably the land.
Interesting how that's framed, just as an aside, this is Lynn Carlson. One of my sons lives in LA and he happens to be in a rent control area. And the owners of the apartment buildings are now going from place to place, offering $50,000 to $60,000 to the renter to move. And then once they move, then it's no longer subject to the current rent control, and they can go to the market level. And building after building, you take the average renter and you put $50,000, $60,000 on the table, and many of them are willing to take that up front and then move.
Sounds like.
Well,
But that's how it has to be structured in that part of LA at any rate. But be interesting to see how an ordinance would ultimately be drafted, because there are some.
And you don't have a reset. You don't have to have a reset when somebody moves out under a rent control structure. You could provide them.
Have it structured different ways. Yeah, I don't mean to debate the rent control issue in terms of the specifics, because there's a lot of different ways they can be set up, but that happens to be the particular neighborhood, at least that he's in, which is in the Hollywood area. It's a highly desirable area to live, and therefore the owners of the buildings are buying out the renters. They haven't offered him in his building yet, but he said he would decline because he figures his rent would go up about $1,000.
And as I said, it's a city council proposed measure, so it will come before the Charter Commission for review. At least right now, I don't see that the Charter Commission would have any objection to putting that on the ballot. The state law provides that it's an appropriate subject for a charter. And if the council wants to put it on the ballot, the Charter Commission would probably not get in the way.
Well, but Barry, wouldn't it be fair to say that the Charter Commission's not going to say it's a good idea or a bad idea on the merits? You're not going to be studying it. So no one should suggest that the Charter Commission supports it just because you allow it to be on the ballot.
No. The Charter Commission, when it reviews a city council provision, can either accept the council provision, reject the council provision, or propose a substitute. And if the Charter Commission proposes a substitute, the council can either adopt its original question to put on the ballot, adopt the Charter Commission's substitute, or not put anything on the ballot. But after it submits it to the Charter Commission, the City Council may not change the provision. If they change one word, it starts the whole review process over again.
Wow.
Could you talk about the language that goes on the ballot and how that's determined?
The ballot question is drafted by the City Council ultimately. The reality is that at least when the Charter Commission proposes amendments, we attach our own proposed ballot question. And usually we attach that after working with the city attorney that's assigned to the Charter Commission to develop that language. And in most cases, that has become the ballot question language.
If the council wants to undercut you, can they change your wording?
They could. I mean, obviously, having control of the ballot question is a significant power, because you can frame any question in a way that you would want the answer to be yes or no. But ultimately, again, it's the city attorney that comes up with the language. And to date, the city council has acted in good faith in moving these questions forward.
You know, last time or last election, when there was the amendment about in year one, there would be election of, 2 years in year 3 and year 4. It was so confusing that I think probably most voters didn't know what they were voting on. I don't know if people agree with that, but
I would agree with that.
yeah. Was that the city attorney's language, or how did it end up that way?
Yes, it was, but I forgive them for that, because it's a very, very complicated scheme. The reason that they have the extra election is because there's a state law that says that once the city has been redistricted, you have to have an election. You can't wait 4 years for an election. So if the city is redistricted in 2022, which it will be, and which, by the way, the Charter Commission is responsible for redistricting the city, that means that people will be living in wards that may or may not be the old ward where their council member was elected from. So the state law says you have to have a new municipal election to conform to those new district boundaries. So that's why, and it only happens every 20 years, because the next year that ends in the year
0.
In the next decade, the council will be elected in 2033, not 2031. So that means the council will be elected after the city has been redistricted and will be elected in the new districts.
Is there a chance that conflicting amendments will end up before the voters and they could essentially vote on contradictory amendments?
Yes, there is. There is that.
What happens then?
I mean, for example, the council proposed amendment in essence moves more control of the police department over to the council as opposed to the mayor. And if the government structure proposal says the mayor has responsibility over department heads, and if those both pass, then what is the outcome?
So Barry, I thought I saw an email that suggested that the language wasn't ready on the city council's amendment, but they still went ahead with a first reading. But I was kind of confused about how they could go ahead if the language wasn't settled yet.
Good question. I think the council was not really paying attention to the calendar, and they did the math in January and determined that if they wanted to make this Charter Commission proof and give us our 150 days, they had to have something proposed and out the door by March 1. And that means basically skipping or doing the reading without clear language as to what the proposal is going to be.
It doesn't sound like a reading to me.
It sounds like exactly the symptoms that we're complaining about that we need the charter change for.
So we've got another question, Barry. At least I saw one of the drafts, and I don't know where things are at in terms of drafting, but there was one draft from the study committee of the Charter Commission that looked at having two parts of this charter amendment, one of which does what we've been talking about, but the other part, in effect, disciplined the city council if they so much as got involved in directing the council, or directing the department heads. Could you tell me where's that at and what was that like? What was the nature of that proposal?
That proposal, there's provisions like that in place in Duluth and other municipalities around the country. We jokingly called it the prime directive if you're a Star Trek fan, because they always had the non-interference directive. But we took that out at our last drafting session because we thought, at least I thought, that would make our proposal vulnerable. Council members were already starting to say, I won't even be able to go into Public Works and tell them your street didn't get plowed if this passes, because I'll be removed from office. Now, that's not the intent of the provision, but we wanted to, I think we've considered that we will look at similar language, but not with provisions of penalties and removal from office. It'll just attempt to make clear what's in the legislative column and what's in the executive column.
Is it possible, Barry, sorry for interrupting, but is it possible for that to be in the ethics code? And is the ethics code just a thought? Because and is that something that could even be, could an amendment to the ethics code appropriately be put before the voters as a charter change? I guess is really my question.
The ethics code, at least up to now, has never been part of the charter. I don't see any reason why it couldn't be. It certainly deals with the form and structure of city government.
I think that would dilute the issue enormously.
We, again, we talked to formal electeds, including Paul and other city council presidents. And we asked the city council presidents what would happen in your time in office if somebody were getting involved. And one of them said, I would invite that council member down to my office for a talk, and then it would never happen again. So it depends on what kind of person you have in that role and whether or not that person has that kind of authority over the council members.
Do you see this proposal very essentially changing in any way the role of the president of the city council? That person in times has emerged as the foremost spokesperson for the city, the go-to person. How is that going to be affected by this thing?
I think it would affect that role. I mean, right now, as you say, the council president is arguably one of the most powerful politician in the city, even though they got less than 4,000 votes at the last election. But that's because they have a role in administration, which they would not have if this passed.
They have a role in policy too. They're very heavy in policy.
Of course they are. They should have a role in policy. They're the
heavy in
head of
policy and they're heavy in administration.
But they should have a role in policy. In fact, we want to make it clear that the council is the policy-making, legislative, and oversight function of the city. But they are not the administrative function of the city. That should be in the mayor's office.
You can still see then the city president of the city council advancing a 2040 city plan with the support of majority of the city council, regardless of what the mayor doesn't like.
Of course.
Okay.
The mayor would have a veto right when that passes the council.
It requires that he or she have 9 members of the city council behind their leadership role, rather than a majority. That's also a difference.
That's right.
So
I think Nancy Pelosi has the same problem.
well, she gets the authority in part because she has to govern a body of 435 people.
Imagine 435 bosses.
That's it, Dave. So she gets it because they can't logically figure out another way to do that.
Is there any chance that that analogy to the federal government could be used as marketing in this election, explaining to voters what it is that the charter amendment proposal is trying to do?
I think it could be. And I think that's a good approach because everybody, most people anyway, are familiar with how our federal government and our state government operate. And that there's a legislature that legislates and there's an executive that runs the administration.
Yeah.
And most people will understand that and say, well, that makes sense. Plus, it's the way it is in virtually every other mayor council system in the country. There are several forms of municipal government that are commonly used. One would be the city manager system that Paul Ostrow mentioned. Another, but the most common is probably the mayor council system. And in virtually every other system, the mayor does the administration and the council legislates.
And
That's all we're suggesting.
And is the mayor part of the council chair?
Usually not in mayor council system, but sometimes that's true. In fact, in a true weak mayor system, the mayor is usually elected from among the council members. They don't have a veto right, and their position is largely ministerial.
Can you talk a little bit about the 612 effort?
I probably know as much about it as you do.
Okay.
As I've just read.
But it's going to be supportive, right?
What is the 612 thing?
You know, as I listen to the discussion with my background being in the legislature, I see a lot of parallels to what you're talking about, you know, the role of the administration, the role of the legislature. There's basically some pretty clear lines. I just happen to remember when I was chairing Ways and Means a few years ago, and I talked to the commissioner of MMB, and I had an issue, and he kind of smiled and he said, Lynn, you've got to remember, I've got a boss, which was referencing the governor. But he said, I'll bring it up to him. And but clearly there is that line, not that there isn't some back and forth and some discussions, but it seems like there's clearer lines of authority than what you're talking about with the city of Minneapolis and 14 bosses, so to speak. By the way, I misspoke on the renters thing. It's 30,000, not 60 that they're offering. But at any rate, I was only making the point that it all depends on how that would be structured in terms of how workable it ultimately would be in terms of the final ordinance. But I find this discussion kind of interesting because I keep putting it in the ballpark that I'm familiar with, which is St. Paul.
But that's one reason we took out the prime directive language, the language that would remove people from office. We don't want to make it impossible for council members to go in and talk to department heads. They do that all the time. You know, I want a stop sign for my constituent, the such and such street wasn't plowed. That kind of thing is fine. We expect that as they perform their role of doing constituent services. What we don't want them to do is to give commands, and we want to empower the department heads to know that the mayor is their boss and the mayor has their back.
How many cities in Minnesota have an elective city council that is full-time, paid full-time with staff?
I don't know.
Probably a
Relatively.
lot. In major cities, certainly.
Yeah, what about St. Paul, and what about
Right,
Duluth and Rochester and whatever? Do they all have that?
No.
All the cities of the first class do, yes. They have compensated councils.
So they have full-time city councils and full-time staff assigned to those people.
No.
St. Paul not too many years ago, switched to a part-time council. But
Right.
Okay, that's what I'm saying. And that's significantly different than, and this doesn't change that.
no.
No.
Barry Gilgee here. I was gone a half an hour, so I apologize if this question came up. But there is one function in Minneapolis, some would say the most important function of all in Minneapolis, and the mayor plays absolutely no role, nor does the city council. And people are really concerned about what about the future of this city with that function not as being run as well as it should be. Can you see any role for the mayor or the city council in education?
No. You know, mayors, candidates for mayor always run on, I'll be the education mayor, but the reality is the city has no role in education at all. Education is a state function that is delegated to local school boards by the state. You never see the word school mentioned in the charter. The council has no authority. The mayor has no authority to provide for legislation that would deal with education. What the mayor and the council could do is go to the state and say, we want these changes, but it's really up to the state legislature.
So
A number of years
Mayor,
ago,
we've got the worst disparities in the country in our city with education, but I and the city are helpless.
Well, you vote for your school district representatives that can fix it.
Oh. So we stopped talking about it as a.
Is the school board.
Well,
not the
and
city.
you vote for your legislators too, and the governor who do have controls over education.
But the leader, the mayor is the spokesperson for what goes on in this city. The governor is not the primary person that's going to speak to that question. Nor are the legislators going to speak to that. They're all elected from districts. Where's the mayor in the question of the disparities that we keep hearing and we know exist in the leadership of the city to deal with these questions, these massive, huge, important disparities?
I agree that they're very significant questions, but you can't lay those at the feet of the mayor or the council.
Well, where's the leadership going to come from? It isn't going to come from a group of district elected and or general wide elected school board members. We haven't seen it. We have not seen it yet.
And maybe that's part of the problem.
How do you restructure?
Ultimately, a structural change would have to come from the legislature.
Well, who's going to propose it? From the area which is most massively affected.
I don't know if you heard me. There was a number of years ago a proposal that the mayor have a greater role with the school district, and that was proposed in St. Paul or in the legislature. It didn't go anywhere, and I don't remember what administration it was. It was a number of years ago. It is a model that is used other places, New York, Chicago, for example, where the mayor does have a role with school district issues in those cities. But
you're right. I think Mayor Ryback had a similar proposal.
It may have been. I forget just when it was or which mayor it was.
He was basically suggesting that the mayor would have the ability to appoint some number of school board members.
Oh.
Mm-hmm.
Propose that to the legislature? Was that it?
That would go back to the legislature and would have to be approved.
But the city routinely has a legislative plan program, policies. I mean, adopted by the city council, approved by the mayor. They have their lobbyists in the city, in the legislature, working with the committees, getting amendments put into bills, everything. And the city is one of the many municipal and county organizations, very much a part of the policy lobbying propositions before the legislature. Now that goes on today, has for some time. City spends money on that function.
And who directs it?
It does.
Yep,
And the city
is a question. And what is it clear that the city wants to take leadership on?
And I didn't follow Mayor Ryback's, if I'm correct, proposal to see how far it got. And I don't know whether or not it was part of the city's legislative package or died in some committee at the legislature.
How about parks?
Didn't move forward. I don't even recall if there were hearings on it or not, but I was not on any of the relevant committees, but I remember when it was introduced.
How about the park board, which is under the mayor in St. Paul?
Minneapolis has a unique system. The
But
park board. Park board is independent. And in fact, that was the greatest struggles in getting the plain language charter approved, was to sit down with the city's lawyers and the park board's lawyers, negotiating what the park provision was going to look like in the charter. Because the park board's lawyers were very defensive about their independent status, and appropriately so. But ultimately, everyone agreed as to the language. But the park board is in charge of the parks. Park board resolutions and actions, ordinances that affect the parks are also subject to veto by the mayor. Although our park board has a history of whether or not they agreed the first time around, if the mayor vetoes, they all unite and vote to override the veto. And the park board has its own membership on the Board of Estimate and Taxation and its own budget.
Yes.
Barry, a couple of weeks ago, Clarence Schaubutter here, who staffed the 1969 Citizens League Committee that recommended that the mayor and the city council president positions be merged. We heard about that. And I'm wondering if the Charter Commission considered that or why you didn't come out proposing that.
What we wanted to do is to make the Minneapolis system look like every other mayor council system in the country. There are mayor council systems where the mayor sits on the council, and whether or not that would, and sometimes serves as president of the council and conducts the meetings. But at least my view is that the charter change that is most likely to succeed is incremental change.
Yeah.
And coming up, you could, and people have come along as we've considered this and said, well, you ought to change that too, while you're out to change this, change that. Our plan is keep it simple. If you want to propose that after this passes, that's fine. If you want to propose a separate amendment, that's fine. But let's make this easy for the voters to understand. We had a charter commissioner the other day who said, well, this provision on sidewalk maintenance doesn't make sense. Maybe we should change that too. And the question, do you want the ballot question to read, shall the charter be amended to provide that the mayor appoints the department heads, or shall the charter be amended to provide that the mayor appoint the department heads and the sidewalk funding is you don't want there.
You may be aware the 6 communities that I've represented in my 48 years in the legislature. In all 6 of them, the mayor sits on the council, conducts the meetings, but they're all also the city manager model as well. But it's fairly common in our suburbs. I think it's not just the northwest suburbs where I happen to be that the mayor sits on the council, has a vote on the council.
In cities that aren't cities of the first class, yes, the mayor sits on the council, and but usually in those situations they have a city manager, as you pointed out, and basically the job of the council is to appoint the city manager.
Yeah.
And they're all part-time council members as well as the mayor.
Barry, I want to ask you about the outreach that the Charter Commission members, that you and the Charter Commission members are doing. Obviously, this presentation, and you talked with our condo association the other day. I see you're talking to the DFL Senior Caucus tomorrow. How many of these kind of presentations are you doing? And do you plan to continue to do this as this becomes even more in the public arena? And are your other members going to be doing that as well?
I think I'm committed to doing this after it gets on the ballot, on through during the campaign and until the election date. I'm sure other charter commissioners will as well. Under our rules, I'm the spokesperson of the Charter Commission, but we will certainly authorize any charter commissioners who want to go speak on this subject to do so, and to participate in vote yes political efforts.
Barry, you've been terribly generous with your time, and really appreciate it. But we are getting on to 1 hour and 3/4, and I just wanted to suggest that maybe if there's any urgent questions that some folks think we need to address, let's hear them. But I think we need to look at trying to conclude this meeting too.
This,
I
is-
would-
this
would just-
isn't a question. I'd like to thank Barry for a wonderful presentation and for
Thank you.
years of service that I had no idea about.
I totally agree with you.
Okay, I need to run, but it was very impressive.
Anybody else? Well,
I'll
thanks
do-
again, Barry, for coming, for your very remarkably cogent explanation of the somewhat obtuse activities of the Charter Commission.
But very important, so important.
I'm not
Of
saying
two,
it's important.
my best things, so.